March 6, 1943. Major General George S. Patton, Jr. walked into the headquarters of the U.S. II Corps in North Africa. The building was quiet. Officers moved through the corridors carefully, slowly, like men who already understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Conversations were muted. Eyes stayed low. The air felt heavy, defeated. Then Patton arrived. He wore a polished steel helmet. Ivory-handled revolvers hung at his sides. His uniform was immaculate. His expression made every officer in the building uneasy. By the end of his first day, several officers had been relieved of command. By the end of his first week, the number would climb into the dozens. Within 10 days, II Corps would no longer resemble the force Patton had found. Patton had not been sent to observe. He had been sent to repair a disaster. Only weeks earlier, American forces had suffered the worst defeat U.S. ground troops had experienced in North Africa. The bloodiest week of the war so far. Entire units collapsed. Hundreds of soldiers surrendered. Images of American prisoners, calm, compliant, defeated, were broadcast across the world. For the first time, America's allies questioned whether U.S. troops could fight. For the first time, German commanders believed they had found a weakness. The defeat had a name. Kasserine Pass. February 1943. Central Tunisia. American soldiers, many barely out of training, occupied defensive positions they didn't fully understand, following orders that changed by the hour. Radios crackled with contradictory messages. Units waited for instructions that never came. Then the Germans attacked. They came with armor, artillery, and commanders hardened by years of war. These were veterans of earlier campaigns, men who knew how to exploit hesitation. The Americans hesitated. Forward positions collapsed within hours. Infantry units withdrew without coordination. Tank crews abandoned vehicles that had run out of fuel or ammunition. Officers argued over maps while German armor pushed through gaps that should never have existed. This was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of leadership. At the center of the collapse was II Corps Commander Major General Lloyd Fredendall. He directed the battle from a headquarters nearly 70 miles behind the front, buried underground and isolated from the fighting. When the German offensive intensified, Fredendall could not coordinate a response. He didn't know where his own units were. Orders were issued, revised, and cancelled. Artillery was poorly positioned. Infantry and armor were rarely concentrated. On February 19th, German forces smashed through Kasserine Pass. The defense disintegrated. American units retreated through narrow mountain roads clogged with traffic. Supply trucks collided with tanks. Command posts were abandoned. Entire formations dissolved under pressure. By the time the fighting ended, more than 6,000 American soldiers were casualties. Nearly 200 tanks were destroyed or captured. Hundreds were taken prisoner and paraded before German cameras. British commanders questioned whether American forces could fight effectively. German commanders concluded American units were poorly led and easily defeated. At Allied headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the danger immediately. Another defeat like this could fracture Allied unity. It could convince both allies and enemies that American ground forces were not ready for modern war. Something had to change. And it had to change fast. Eisenhower knew exactly who to send. George S. Patton, Jr. was 57 years old in 1943. He had commanded tanks in World War I and spent the interwar years developing armored warfare doctrine. He was known throughout the Army as a relentless trainer and an uncompromising disciplinarian. Patton believed discipline under pressure separated winning armies from losing ones. He believed American soldiers were not inferior to German soldiers, only poorly led. And he believed that failure in combat command had consequences. Eisenhower also understood Patton's reputation. Patton would not hesitate to relieve officers. He would not protect careers. He would not tolerate excuses. That ruthlessness was exactly what II Corps required. On March 6, Eisenhower relieved Fredendall and appointed Patton commander of II Corps. Patton's orders were simple. Fix this. Make them fight. Do it fast. Patton acted immediately. Within hours of arriving, he issued his first directive. Every soldier in II Corps would wear a helmet and full combat gear at all times. No exceptions. The first officer Patton relieved was sitting at a desk without a helmet. 20 years of service ended in a single sentence. Officers who appeared out of uniform were relieved on the spot. Military courtesy was enforced rigidly. Commanders were ordered forward. Anyone who could not explain their tactical situation was removed. This was not reform. It was a purge. In less than 2 weeks, Patton would transform a defeated, demoralized corps into a force capable of attacking again. He would do it by making one thing unmistakably clear to every officer under his command. Failure had consequences. This is the story of how George S. Patton saved the American Army in North Africa by destroying the careers of dozens of officers. Not because they lacked courage, but because they were not ready. March 7, 1943. At first light, Patton left headquarters and drove toward the front. He did not want reports. He did not want explanations. He wanted to see the army with his own eyes. The jeep moved fast over broken roads. Dust rose behind it in long brown clouds. Officers along the route straightened as it passed, helmets pulled low, collars buttoned tight. Word had already spread. Patton was coming. At the 1st Battalion command post, the battalion commander was not present. He was several miles to the rear, at the regimental headquarters. Patton asked a simple question. "Where are your companies?" The executive officer hesitated. He knew generally. He could point on the map. But he could not answer precisely. Patton did not raise his voice. He relieved the battalion commander on the spot. The executive officer was promoted to acting commander and given a warning. If he could not identify every company position by the next morning, he would be relieved as well. The message was immediate and unmistakable. If you did not know where your men were, you had no right to command them. At the next position, Patton found a company commander whose command post was nearly 500 yards behind his forward platoons. The officer explained that he needed distance to manage communications. Patton listened. Then he told the officer that a company commander belonged with his lead elements, not behind them. If you could not see what your soldiers were seeing, you could not lead them. The officer was relieved and ordered to the rear. Over the next 3 days, Patton repeated this process again and again. He relieved officers who were not at the front. He relieved officers whose defensive positions were poorly organized. He relieved officers who could not explain their mission, their terrain, or their neighboring units. Some were stunned. Some argued. None were spared. Patton did not debate leadership. He enforced it. As the purge continued, Patton began evaluating higher commanders as well. Division and regimental commanders were placed under constant scrutiny. They were expected to appear forward, to understand the ground, and to anticipate enemy action. Major General Orlando Ward of the 1st Armored Division was among those being watched closely. The atmosphere inside II Corps changed rapidly. Every jeep engine caused heads to turn. Every inspection carried risk. Every hesitation could end a career. Officers began sleeping in their boots. Command posts moved forward. Maps were studied constantly. Orders were clarified. Patrols increased. Fear spread, but so did urgency. For the first time since Kasserine, leadership was being held accountable. Patton's actions produced mixed reactions. Some officers were terrified. Others were energized. Among enlisted soldiers and junior officers, something shifted. They saw commanders being removed not for politics or personality, but for performance. The lesson was brutal, but clear. Defeat had consequences. Poor leadership had consequences. And no rank provided immunity. Patton did not limit his efforts to removing officers. He immediately began correcting the tactical failures that had destroyed II Corps at Kasserine. American armor had been used defensively. Patton changed that. Tanks would now be used for aggressive maneuver and rapid exploitation. Artillery coordination had been slow and confused. Patton demanded fire missions be delivered in minutes, not hours. Infantry and armor trained together daily. Soldiers learned how to fight alongside tanks instead of retreating from them. Positions were reorganized. Fields of fire were cleared. Units rehearsed movement under pressure. Speed and aggression became mandatory. Patton made it clear that II Corps would no longer wait to be attacked. They would strike first. They would keep moving. They would impose chaos instead of reacting to it. The training was relentless. Time was short. That urgency came from Patton himself. Eisenhower had approved his request for an offensive toward the town of El Geta. The attack was scheduled for March 17. Patton had 11 days from taking command to launching a major operation. There would be no gradual recovery. No slow rebuilding. II Corps would either fight, or prove the Germans right. Not every officer was removed. Patton actively searched for leaders who had performed well during the Kasserine fighting. Officers who had maintained discipline under pressure. Commanders who had kept their units together when others collapsed. These men were promoted and placed in key positions. One of them was Major General Omar Bradley. Bradley had been sent to North Africa as an observer during the Kasserine battle. His reports to Eisenhower had been calm, accurate, and unsparing. He had identified leadership failures without excuses. Patton recognized his value immediately and made Bradley his deputy commander. Bradley handled coordination and staff work. Patton focused on leadership and combat. It was a partnership that worked. By March 15th, two corps looked different. Headquarters staff had been replaced. Battalion and regimental commanders had changed. Units were forward. Patrols were aggressive. Soldiers moved with purpose. But the most important transformation was not tactical. It was psychological. American soldiers began to stop thinking of themselves as beaten. They began to believe they were dangerous. Patton's presence, his confidence, his certainty, was contagious. He did not apologize for defeat. He did not soften his language. He told the men they would win and expected them to prove it. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports described American forces as more aggressive and better coordinated than weeks earlier. Patrols pressed forward. Fire support was faster. Resistance was firmer. The test was coming. And this time, two corps would not be allowed to break. March 17, 1943. 5:30 a.m. American artillery opened fire on German positions near the town of El Geta. The barrage lasted 30 minutes. Shells tore into ridgelines and defensive works. The sound rolled across the valley, steady and relentless. Then the guns fell silent. American infantry and armor moved forward. This was not the same army that had collapsed at Kasserine Pass. These were the same soldiers, but under different leadership. The 1st Infantry Division led the attack. Units advanced in coordination with tanks. Artillery followed closely. Communications held. Orders were clear. By midday, American forces had pushed more than 6 miles forward. El Geta was captured. The objective had been taken ahead of schedule. But Patton knew the battle was not over. The Germans would counterattack. They always did. 4 days after the capture, two corps prepared for the response. Positions were strengthened. Anti-tank guns were emplaced carefully. Artillery was registered on likely avenues of approach. Infantry dug in, not with panic, but with discipline. Patton visited positions constantly. He checked fields of fire. He questioned officers. He corrected mistakes immediately. There were no speeches now. No theatrics. Only preparation. March 23, 1943. The German counterattack began. Panzer units advanced head-on toward American lines, confident that the Americans would break as they had before. They did not. American artillery opened fire with precision. The first wave of German tanks was hit before it reached effective range. Anti-tank guns engaged at close distance. Infantry held their positions instead of retreating. There was no collapse. No confusion. No uncontrolled withdrawal. German armor burned in the valley. More than 30 German tanks were destroyed. The attack stalled. Then failed. For the first time in North Africa, American forces had stopped a German armored assault and held their ground. The psychological damage of Kasserine began to fade. The significance of El Geta was not measured in territory. It was measured in belief. American soldiers had faced German tanks and stayed. American officers had coordinated under pressure and succeeded. American artillery had responded instantly and decisively. Two corps had proven it could fight. German commanders were surprised. Intelligence reports noted the change clearly. American units were more aggressive, better coordinated, more resilient. The weakness they thought they had identified was gone. In the weeks that followed, two corps continued to advance. By early April, American forces had moved more than 50 miles forward. German resistance stiffened, but it did not break American momentum. The corps that had been routed at Kasserine was now a competent, dangerous fighting force. And Patton's methods had been validated. But the cost of that transformation was real. Dozens of officers had been removed during Patton's purge. Most were headquarters staff officers and battalion commanders. A few were regimental commanders. Some were reassigned to training roles in the United States. Others disappeared quietly into staff positions. Their combat leadership careers were over. Some had been genuinely incompetent. Some had failed under pressure. Some had made fatal decisions. Others were capable administrators who simply were not suited for frontline combat leadership. Patton made no distinction. Combat command required aggression, decisiveness, and presence at the front. Anyone who could not provide that was removed. The army handled these reliefs quietly. No courts-martial. No formal charges. Officers were reassigned with vague explanations. The institution was protected. The individuals were not. Many packed their belongings in silence and left under cover of darkness. They would spend the rest of their lives wondering what might have been different. Those who remained understood the lesson. Leadership under fire was unforgiving. Mistakes had consequences. Performance mattered more than intentions. This culture did not end with North Africa. Throughout the rest of the war, American forces would develop a reputation for relieving commanders quickly when they failed. Even senior officers were not immune. Rank no longer guaranteed protection. The army became more adaptable, more ruthless, more effective. Patton commanded 2 corps for only 40 days. On April 15, 1943, he was reassigned to command forces preparing for the invasion of Sicily. Omar Bradley was promoted to command 2 corps. Bradley maintained Patton's standards. Discipline remained strict. Aggression remained mandatory. The culture Patton had created persisted. 2 corps would go on to fight successfully in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. The divisions that had collapsed at Kasserine became veteran formations with strong combat records. Patton himself would command the 7th Army in Sicily and later the 3rd Army in France. He would become the most famous American ground commander of the war. But the North African purge remained controversial. Some believed Patton had saved thousands of lives by removing weak leadership. Others believed he had destroyed careers unnecessarily. Both were true. By May 1943, the North African campaign was over. American forces had proven they could fight, and win, against the Wehrmacht. The difference between Kasserine Pass and El-Gheta was not equipment. It was not numbers. It was leadership. Patton saved the American army by breaking it first. He sacrificed the careers of the few to save the lives of the many. And when 2 corps stood its ground at El-Gheta, those soldiers fought not because they were ordered to, but because they finally believed they could win. By the spring of 1943, the transformation was complete. The American army that had fled through Kasserine Pass no longer existed. In its place stood a force that could plan, maneuver, and hold its ground against German armor. A force that had learned, brutally, what modern war demanded. And at the center of that transformation stood George S. Patton, Jr. But victory came with a price. Dozens of officers never returned to combat command. Most were not publicly disgraced. There were no courts-martial. No official accusations. The army handled the reliefs quietly, efficiently, and without explanation. Officers were reassigned to training posts, staff jobs, stateside commands. Their names faded from the front lines and from history. Some of them deserved removal. Some had frozen under fire. Some had failed to lead when leadership mattered most. Others were competent, hard-working officers who simply were not suited for battlefield command. Men who had trained soldiers, built units, and followed doctrine until doctrine failed them. Patton did not differentiate. In his view, combat leadership was absolute. Either you imposed your will on the battlefield, or the enemy would. There was no middle ground. For the officers who remained, the lesson was unmistakable. Rank would not protect you. Seniority would not protect you. Intentions would not protect you. Only results mattered. This philosophy reshaped the U.S. Army. Throughout the rest of World War II, American forces developed a reputation for rapidly relieving commanders who failed to perform. The practice shocked British officers, who favored reassignment over removal. But the American system created something different. An army that adapted quickly. An army that corrected failure immediately. An army that learned faster than its enemies. That culture began at Kasserine. Patton himself did not remain untouched by the system he helped create. In 1945, after Germany's defeat, Patton was relieved of command, not for battlefield failure, but for outspoken political statements that embarrassed the army and its allies. The same institution that had empowered his ruthlessness eventually applied its rules to him. Performance mattered. Discipline mattered. Public conduct mattered. No one was indispensable. By the end of the war, the officers Patton had promoted had gone on to distinguished careers. Omar Bradley would command entire army groups. Others would lead divisions across Europe. The soldiers of two corps, once humiliated, became veterans who stormed beaches, crossed rivers, and pushed deep into Axis territory. They carried with them the lessons learned in North Africa. That hesitation kills. That leadership decides outcomes. That discipline under pressure is not optional. Historians continue to debate Patton's methods. Some argue he destroyed careers unnecessarily. That his intolerance allowed no room for growth. That fear is a dangerous leadership tool. Others argue the opposite. That Patton saved lives by acting decisively. That removing weak leaders early prevented greater disasters later. That modern war is too unforgiving for hesitation. Both arguments hold truth. But the results remain undeniable. At Kasserine Pass, two corps collapsed. At El Geta, two corps held and won. The difference was not equipment. It was not numbers. It was leadership. Patton's North African purge taught the American army a lesson it never forgot. Leadership is not about intention. It is not about seniority. It is not about reputation. Leadership is about performance, under fire. Patton saved the army by breaking it first. He shattered complacency. He destroyed careers. He forced accountability where none had existed. He made officers fear failure more than the enemy. And in doing so, he gave American soldiers something they had lost at Kasserine: confidence. When two corps fought again, they did not fight because they were ordered to. They fought because they believed. And that belief, born from discipline, fear, and ruthless accountability, carried them all the way from the deserts of North Africa to the heart of Europe.